New View here with Gavin, James and Colin. We're back today from our summer holidays and we hope all of our listeners had a fantastic summer break, that you were able to catch up with all of our previous episodes and enjoyed a bit of sunshine, even though there's not much to be got out there today. We're joined by David Cullinane, TD today, Waterford representative. David, you're very welcome to the programme.
Hello, Margaret.
Very glad to have you. Our questions will be broken up today based on different topics which we've agreed in advance, which are governance, the topic of Northern Ireland, Brexit, presidential election, and also topical affairs. So, James, I'm going to hand over to you with the first question on governance for David.
So it's been almost 2 years since the Stormont Assembly is set, and former Taoiseach Bertie Ahern said that both Sinn Féin and the DUP owe it to the people of Northern Ireland to get things running again. So how, in your opinion, how responsible are Sinn Féin for this impact?
Well, first of all, I would say that Sinn Féin would be more in tune with where nationalists in the north are at than any politician or former politician from Fianna Fáil would be. The Sinn Féin vote has gone up in every single election, including in the last general election and the last assembly election in the north. And the reason why the Sinn Féin vote went up is because we took a decision, and it was Martin McGuinness at the time who took a decision that we were no longer able to sit in government with the DUP, honouring all of the obligations that we made. And bear in mind, we've had a number of agreements since the Good Friday Agreement. We've had the St Andrews Agreement, the Stormont House Agreement, the Fresh Start Agreement. A lot of them deal with very real issues that affect not just nationalists but unionists as well. Welfare reform, economic reform, reform of the public service, and also issues important to nationalists, the Irish Language Act, and essentially equality issues. And a Bill of Rights which would look at issues like marriage equality for citizens in the north as well. So we sat in government for 10 years with unionists, and we have delivered on every single commitment that we gave, including on legacy issues which are important to put in place: truth and reconciliation processes, information recovery processes, for example. We signed up to all of those. The DUP haven't. They signed up to them in principle with these agreements but haven't delivered upon them. And it gets to a point that if you're in a partnership government and one side delivers on every single promise and commitment that they make and the other side doesn't, you have to at some point call time, and that's what we've done. Since then we've made an effort, and if you remember last year there was intensive talks and negotiations on trying to get the Assembly up and running again. Bertie Ahern would know that. He would know that those talks took place over a long period of time, supported by both governments. We had the draft agreement. It was signed off on in principle by the leader of the DUP. We thought that the agreement was over the line, and she brought that agreement back to her party and they knocked it back. And since then we haven't had any agreement or any talks. So, you know, you can't have a partnership government, whether it's north or south of Ireland. You can't have a partnership government if you don't have genuine partnership, if it's one side delivers on all of their commitments and the other side doesn't. And there was also a sense as well from nationalists that Arlene Foster had become very arrogant as a DUP leader, and that no respect was being shown to the nationalist community. Now I think some efforts have been made by her since, by attending a GAA match, and all of that's important and we welcome that. But there is a draft agreement on the table. We've signed up to it, both governments have signed up to it, and it's a matter of whether the DUP sign up to it. So I would agree with Bertie Ahern when he says there should be a power sharing government. Of course there should, but it can't be on the basis of not dealing with the issues which affect people. And you know, we want marriage equality, for example, to be available to everybody on the island of Ireland, not just people who live in the south. We want abortion rights to be made available to everybody on the island of Ireland, not just people in the south. So all of those issues of equality are important to people, not just nationalists but many unionists as well. And we're not going to buckle on those issues. You know, we want to see these issues resolved, and whatever about issues like marriage equality and abortion, which weren't part of previous agreements. Issues like the Irish Language Act, for example, were part of previous agreements and haven't been delivered. And that goes to the heart of parity of esteem for both nationalists and unionists. So we're certainly up for the power sharing institutions being restored. It doesn't suit us for them not to be up and running. We want them up and running, but it can't be at any price. And it can't be at a cost of Sinn Féin sitting in government with the DUP delivering on every single commitment that we made, rightly so, because that's what we do, but not having them deliver on any of the commitments that they gave. And obviously the nationalist community weren't going to put up with that, and we've seen in subsequent votes that the Sinn Féin vote has gone up.
David, you mentioned the Irish Language Act, and the collapse of the government really centred around that. And with Sinn Féin, we know they occupy 27 out of 90 seats in Stormont, and in Westminster 18, which they abstained from. But with that, the seats they abstained, can you understand why people might question their ability to govern?
Well, first of all, it wasn't collapsed because of the Irish Language Act. That wasn't the issue, that the institutions came down. The primary reason was that there was a whole range of issues from the Mays site, where there was agreement on what should happen with that, and then the DUP reneged on it. There was allegations of corruption with NAMA, associations with senior DUP politicians. We had the RHI scandal, where hundreds of millions of or pounds of taxpayers' money was essentially squandered, and there was again allegations of corruption, and there still is a live investigation into what happened there. And yes, the Irish Language Act was also part of it, but it wasn't the primary reason why. So the whole raft of reasons why the institutions came down, and it was Martin McGuinness who was one of the most enthusiastic supporters of devolved government, who worked with 3 different DUP leaders, who stretched himself and reached out to unionists in ways that unionist leaders haven't reached out to nationalists, and was very comfortable in doing that, because he recognises that in any United Ireland, in any republic, unionists have to have their rightful place, and nationalists have to treat unionists as equals, which we do. So there was a whole range of reasons why, and it wasn't simply down to the Irish Language Act. I think it was a lazy narrative from some of the media to reduce it down to this is all about the Irish language. It isn't, but it is important, and for those who see themselves as nationalists, that is part of their culture. The GAA is part of their culture. It's part of Irish identity, so it doesn't threaten anybody. So really the question should be, well, why would the DUP and why would unionist politicians be so fearful of an Irish Language Act? Why are they so fearful of Irish culture and Irish identity? And it goes right to the heart of people's rights. But I wouldn't agree that it's the only issue. In relation to Westminster, we had a Westminster election. The people of the North had an opportunity to vote for SDLP candidates who would have taken their seats. Every single SDLP MP lost their seats, and Sinn Féin won all of the nationalist seats. And we did so because the nationalist community understand that Westminster is not the place to sort out Irish issues. It's not going to be the place that will deliver a good or a bad Brexit for Ireland. That will happen through a negotiation that's happening now between the British government and the European Union. The withdrawal agreement will be sorted out at that level. The SNP, for example, in Scotland take their seats in Westminster. They don't have any voice when it comes to the negotiations. In fact, they tabled amendments to a bill recently in the House of Commons that the final withdrawal agreement would have to go before the Parliament in Scotland. That was rejected. So that's the contempt, I suppose, that Westminster and the Tory government would have for devolved governments in the north or Scotland. So we're Irish Republicans anyway. We're not going to take our seats in Westminster. There's no value in Sinn Féin taking our seats in Westminster, and the gravity of politics is more and should be more in the north and in restoring the power sharing institutions, and not having debates about whether Sinn Féin should take their seats in Westminster, which is not going to happen. It's never going to happen. And if people don't agree with that, they don't have to vote for Sinn Féin. They can vote for SDLP candidates. But they didn't, and they voted for Sinn Féin in record numbers. In fact, in the last Westminster election, we had the biggest vote that Sinn Féin ever received in any election. So for people to ask us then to betray those people who voted for us, to take our seats in Westminster and vote on something that is not going to make any difference, because the Labour Party and the Tory Party are not going to support Sinn Féin on votes in Westminster. So it's a false argument, and it's been made by parties down south who don't fully understand the north, who only use the north to attack Sinn Féin, and that's their prerogative. But as I said at the very start, we're very grounded in where nationalists are at. And we'll wait and see. We'll wait and see. The next Westminster election could be sooner than we think, given what's happening over there. We'll be putting forward candidates again on an abstentionist basis. The SDLP and others will put forward candidates based on taking their seats. And we'll see what the electorate say.
And how far do you think we are away from a government in the north again?
Well, that's up to the DUP. It's
So
hard.
in your own opinion, can you give us maybe a timeline?
No, because we would have wanted the assembly up and running months ago. In fact, we never wanted it to come down in the first place.
Yeah.
It was a reluctant decision that Martin McGuinness took, because we're defenders of the Good Friday Agreement. We're trying to implement other elements of the Good Friday Agreement which haven't been delivered. So it is in our interests to have democratic power-sharing institutions up and running in the north. But the whole basis of the power-sharing institutions is that it was a partnership government. And in any partnership government, you have in this state, you sign up to a programme for government, and then all parties have to deliver on that programme for government. If they don't, then you're in difficulty and in trouble. That's what happened in the north, and not just on one issue, almost on every issue. The DUP were nagged and were unwilling to move, and in more recent times shifted to the right. They supported Brexit, for example, so there was obviously a big difference between our position and every other party and the DUP.
David.
So this isn't just about, and again, it isn't about a conflict between Sinn Féin and the DUP. The SDLP, Sinn Féin, the Ulster Unionist Party, the Alliance Party are all aligned that we want unresolved issues that haven't been delivered as part of the Good Friday Agreement delivered, and that we don't want the type of Brexit that the DUP wants for the island or for the north of Ireland. So it isn't simply a Sinn Féin versus DUP issue.
But David, traditionally those who vote DUP and UUP are loyalists. And you mentioned earlier that respect between Protestant and Catholic communities, loyalists and Republicans. Sinn Féin's slogan is building an Ireland of equals. So I want to ask you, and you've mentioned about rights issues such as abortion and gay marriage north of the border. What would a United Ireland look like for Protestants under a 32 county Sinn Féin government?
Well, I think that Martin McGuinness put it best when he said that a United Ireland would have to treat Unionists in a way that Unionists did not treat nationalists in a partitioned Ireland. In other words, that we can't have a United Ireland where we have second-class citizens, where the political rights and the cultural rights of Unionists are not respected. So if we're going to have, and we need to have a debate, which is what we're looking for, is to have a conversation about what a United Ireland would look like. And unionism and those who see themselves as British are entitled to see themselves as British. Their political rights, their identity, their culture has to be fully respected. And I think that will create challenges for people who would describe themselves as nationalists as well. We have to put everything on the table. So if there is going to be a United Ireland, there has to be arrangements as well built into that which protect the rights of those who see themselves as British and see themselves as Unionists. And I wouldn't want to see a United Ireland where Unionists became a minority that saw themselves as oppressed, or where their rights weren't respected.
So would you be happy for those who are loyalist or Protestant in the north for them to continue to hold British passports in a United
Absolutely,
Ireland?
and I think it would be outrageous for anyone who would want to see a genuine United Ireland to want to deprive people who see themselves as British not having British passports and not having a British identity. In fact, I would be comfortable in going further. So I have no problem whatsoever in people in the north who see themselves as British remaining as British as long as they want to. And that's the Good Friday Agreement was very clear that you can be Irish or British or both. A lot of people in the north and more unionists actually see themselves as both. They see themselves as Irish and British. So I think we have to be open to all sorts of possibilities. And the United Ireland isn't just about uniting the two territories of north and south, it's also about uniting the two traditions. And that means that you have to respect the rights of unionists. So I certainly wouldn't want to see a United Ireland that would in any way deprive people who see themselves as British or who identify themselves as Unionists, depriving them of their rights. Because we had a gerrymandered sectarian state in the north in the 60s and before that, where nationalists were treated as second class and third class citizens, and that was overseen by unionist politicians supported by successive British governments, So we don't want to see that. And Bobby Sands, one of his famous quotes was, "Our revenge will be the laughter of our children." And that's Republican, nationalist, loyalist and unionist children. So that's the type of Ireland that we want to build.
David, regarding the future of Northern Ireland, could you see a return to the Troubles?
I don't know. I don't see any basis upon which there would be any return to conflict.
Even with a prospective United Ireland?
No, I think it depends on a number of different factors, but I don't see that as a possibility. Which is why I think it's important that and I think a United Ireland is inevitable. All of the demographics, almost every age group now in the next 20, 30 years, nationalists are going to be in the majority.
Yeah.
So we're moving towards a United Ireland, whether people like it or not. It's inevitable, and at some point we're going to have a border poll on the United Ireland, and I think what we need to do is to set the tone for that. And part of setting the tone for that is for all politicians, and we've invested a lot in this, which is to reach out to those who are unionist and have conversations with them about what their place would look like. And it's interesting that you now have very senior unionist politicians, including Peter Robinson, talking about the possibility of United Ireland. That wouldn't have happened 5 years ago or 10 years ago. They wouldn't have accepted it was even a possibility. Now they accept that it is. And political leaders in the South, including the Taoiseach, is talking about the inevitability of United Ireland.
Yeah.
So the point is we have to plan for it, and we can't fall into it. And it can't just be picking the two different states, North and South, and joining them together, and the worst parts of both states, forming what would be a new United Ireland. It's actually an exciting prospect, and I think that's really something that we should examine. I think it's really exciting that we could have a United Ireland, a new republic, and then a debate should be what type of Ireland that should be. And remember, if we're going to have a United Ireland, it will be voted on by people North and South.
Yeah.
So if there is ever to be United Ireland, a majority of people in the North and a majority of people in the South will vote for it. So whatever United Ireland we have will have huge democratic underpinning.
Yeah.
And I think that will be that will be massive, and I think that will lessen the possibility of any return to conflict, which I just don't think is a possibility.
It's interesting you say that, because a lot of people my age, or around my age, who will talk to you about United Ireland say we won't be able to afford it, and then a lot of people who might have been alive during the Troubles say they'll see a return to the Troubles if it ever comes up. So it's interesting that you say that, and then when I speak to people, the two sides.
Well, listen, first of all, people will have memories of a conflict, and I think the conflict is long gone. The last ceasefire was in 1997. The first IRA ceasefire was in 1994. So we've had a long peace process. It's one of the most successful peace processes in the world. You can never take it for granted, which is why we want the institutions back up and running as quickly as possible. You don't want to create a vacuum for too long. So, but I don't think that there is any basis for any return to conflict from either side, whether it's Republican or Unionist. So I don't see it as a possibility. In respect of affording a United Ireland, there's all sorts of figures which are put out there by those who will be against it. But the same arguments were made when Germany was partitioned and other countries were partitioned, that they wouldn't be able to afford it. When Germany was united, in any United Ireland, you're going to be bringing together two different health services, two different education systems, two different agencies, for example, that would promote Ireland internationally in terms of tourism or jobs or whatever. And there's an opportunity then to get the best of what we have in the north and in the south. And it just makes sense in an island the size of Ireland that you would have one single health service. You wouldn't have two different sets of bureaucracy. So there's an awful lot of money can be saved in that. I don't buy the argument that it will cost money. Now obviously there is a subvention which comes from the British government to the north. Yeah. But in United Ireland we will see that continuing for some time until we would see more economic growth in the north. It's not going to be the case that Britain will simply withdraw and all of its obligations are gone. In that, I don't think that's going to be a scenario.
But David,
I don't see the cost of it being an issue. I think there's actually more of a benefit rather than a cost.
But could you foresee the nationalists up north might look at the situation down here and see older people on trolleys for 24, 48, 72 hours? They look at their university system in the north and go, why would we want to join the South with the education and health issues that are going on down there?
But equally, they could look south and see that people who are gay or lesbian can marry, which they can't in the north. Or they could look south and see that women who are in a crisis pregnancy will be able to, at some point, once the legislation is passed, have an abortion. So there is an awful lot of positive social change that's happening in Ireland, and it isn't coming from the politicians, it's coming from the people who are making these demands. So my point is that if we're going to have a united Ireland, in my view, that gives us an opportunity then to reflect on what type of Ireland that would be for people north and south. I don't want to see an Ireland where people are left in hospital trolleys. I have a vision for public health services in the same way that I'd have a vision for more ambitious public housing that simply wouldn't be social housing. You'd have affordable rents, affordable purchases as well. So public housing in this state is seen primarily for those who are on low incomes.
We will get to housing in a while.
And that's not the case in most European countries. So we have the ability to have an Ireland north and south that doesn't have patients on trolleys, it doesn't have a housing crisis, and it does afford rights to people north or south, east or west, and that's what I would want to see in United Ireland. So of course all sorts of arguments will be put forward where we have this in the north, we don't have it in the south, or we have this in the south, we don't have it in the north. But a United Ireland gives us an opportunity to have the best of all worlds.
Okay.
And I think that's the type of argument that I would put forward.
David, when in your opinion would be the right time for a border poll and reunification in the future? What time period?
Well, the timing of it is something that obviously has to be agreed. So we've said in the next 5 years we want it. Obviously in the immediate short term we're dealing with Brexit, and Brexit is not good.
Do you think it will happen in the next 5 years?
I hope it'll happen in the next 5 years, but if it doesn't happen, I think we're going to arrive at a situation where a united Ireland will become much more inevitable. The demographics will show that the numbers of people, if you look at all of the opinion polls in recent times, in the north, more people are saying they would vote for a united Ireland than ever have done so in the past. So that's only going to increase over the next number of years. So when we say we want a border poll in the next 5 years, we're essentially saying that everybody now needs to be preparing for the inevitable. And in preparing for the inevitable, we need to be having conversations like we're having now about what type of Ireland we want. What would a united Ireland look like? And dealing with all of these myths, or maybe reality around how much it would cost, what impact it would have north or south, how you would do it, how you would manage it, and what type of rights you would want to see underpinned in that republic. All of those issues need to be teased out. But the problem is that we have other politicians who, for others, maybe selfish reasons in political parties, who don't want to have that debate and are trying to put it off and are saying that now is not the time for a border poll. Well, they have to tell us then when the time will be right. We believe that the time is right to at least have a discussion about what a united Ireland would look like. And at some point we will have a border poll. It's inevitable that we will have one. And we're saying sometime in the next 5 years, but we can't put a date on it because we're not in control of when that should be. And also we want it to be done in a collaborative way. We want agreement on when that should be, and we want any debate leading up to that referendum to be respectful and to be one that's genuinely about having a discussion about the type of Ireland everybody, unionists and nationalists, would want to see.
You ask a good question about what a united Ireland would look like. And this week Mary Lou MacDonald said to the journal.ie that it could be possible that we have a conversation about a united Ireland joining the British Commonwealth. As a Republican, as a nationalist, what do you think of that?
Well, I think the point that she was making was that everything has to be put on the table. So if we're going to have a negotiation, obviously there are those who are unionists who will put their issues on the table. They possibly would want to see a united Ireland being part of the Commonwealth. What Mary Lou was saying was that she's a Republican, we don't really see any value in the Commonwealth as such. But if it was something that was important to unionists, that's obviously something that would have to be put on the table. But we'd have to look at the bigger picture, because we have to make sure that, and we shouldn't be afraid of this. For those of us who see ourselves as nationalists or Republicans, we can't be afraid to compromise with those who see themselves as unionists. And we have always said that unionists have nothing to fear from equality for nationalists, but they saw that they had something to fear. They were led to believe by their political masters for almost a generation that they were superior, that they had something to lose if there was equality, which is why they still resist the equality agenda even today, in terms of the DUP. But we don't have anything to fear for to have equality for those who see themselves as British or unionist, and we shouldn't see it in that way. So I don't have a difficulty in principle in terms of any of those issues being put on the table, and then that would have to be part of a negotiation. And ultimately, whatever arrangement is put in place and whatever United Ireland is agreed, then that will be something that would have to be supported by the people, north and south, which is also important as well. If in terms of having a border poll, I think people need to have some sense of what type of United Ireland will emerge following a border poll, because you have your border poll and people north or south can agree that there will be United Ireland, but I'm sure that people would want to have some sense of what that would be before they
vote
would vote.
James has a question which links the north and the south now.
So after 2 years of non-participation in government in the north, and having worked with the Democratic Unionist Party, do Sinn Féin have the necessary experience to go into coalition with the likes of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael down south?
We have very, very capable people in the Dáil that would make very good ministers.
We can see that today, huh?
And I would say, if I was looking at, say, the big issues affecting people in this state, and housing being the main one. In fact, today we had reports out with rising rents. We had a report out from the Simon community where people who were in need of the housing assist programme, for example, can't find properties because of the rent caps. We have record levels of homelessness. Owen O'Brien is our housing spokesperson, and in my view would make a much better Minister for Housing than Owen Murphy. We have a crisis in healthcare. We have a two-tier healthcare system. Again, we have record numbers of people in hospital trolleys, over 1 million patients waiting to see a consultant in public hospitals. That was a figure that was released a couple of weeks ago. Again, record levels. People waiting years to see a consultant, cancer patients waiting for scans, having to go private, and families scraping together the money for them to go and get private scans because they can't depend on the public system. I think that Louise O'Reilly, who is our health spokesperson, would make a better Minister for Health. And it's down to what type of public services you want, what type of economy you want, what type of country you want. And there's this notion as well, and this is a myth that was peddled by the other parties for years when it comes to Sinn Féin. Well, Sinn Féin doesn't have economic policies, Sinn Féin would ruin the economy and all this nonsense. And I listened to that well before the economic crash, and it was actually the policies that we warned against. That was low light touch regulation in the banks, cutting taxes for those on high incomes to an extent that they hollowed out the tax base, giving tax breaks and tax shelters. All of that came crashing down and had a huge impact on people's lives. We had an economic crisis which created now, and we're still living with the consequences of it in health and housing and public services and childcare and all of those issues, and education. Almost all of them are still paying the price for. Student fees have gone up and went up during those years. And all of that was down to policies that we warned against. So we're certainly capable of being in government. We want a strong economy. We support small and medium-sized businesses. We have no difficulty in foreign direct investment, notwithstanding what our opponents would say. We just want fair taxation. And with fair taxation, then you use the wealth that is created from any economy to provide for all citizens. That's the type of Ireland that we want. So I don't believe that it's good enough that we just simply have a slogan, keep the recovery going, and you throw out these figures of we have X amount of economic growth. That's of no consequence to people who are lying in a hospital trolley, or who don't have a home, or who are living on their parents' couches or grandparents' couches.
So David, you've said about these different members of Sinn Féin who would make better ministers than what we currently have. So would you be willing to maybe trade off certain policies to go into coalition with Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael, who are the ones behind these policies who have gotten us to where we are now, just to get a few ministers in who might be able to make some change?
Well, first of all, that's part of the problem, is that parties in the past have looked at this through the prism of we just want to get a few ministers in, or it's our turn to be in government, or we want to be in government for the sake of it. And we saw it with Labour, we saw it with the Greens, we saw it with other smaller parties as well, and it doesn't work. And it's the wrong way to approach it. So we have said that, and it isn't all about numbers. Obviously, we'd want to be as strong as we possibly can. So the very first thing we have to do in Sinn Féin is to get the strongest possible mandate for us to be able to go and negotiate the strongest possible programme for government that we can get. And we want a programme for government that's progressive, that isn't about giving tax breaks to the wealthy, that isn't about cutting taxes for high earners at a time when you have all of these social problems, where we do have ambitious plans for public services and delivering for people's rights. That's the type of Ireland that we want. So we would go into any negotiation with a very strong policy platform, and the more TDs that we have, the better. So the first thing we have to do is get a mandate, and then yes, you have to go and negotiate. And we've said that in the aftermath of any election, while our preference would be to have a Sinn Féin led government, if we don't win enough seats, we will use whatever mandate we have to go and talk to other parties. And what's interesting is the question is always put to us. We've said that we will talk to all parties after the next election. Both Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael have said that they categorically will not go into government with Sinn Féin. And yet at the same time, they say that we're fearful of government and we don't want to be in government. So they can't have it both ways. So we're certainly prepared to talk to them. We certainly want to be in government. We're ambitious for the people that we represent. It isn't about personal ambition or just wanting to see different individuals as ministers. It has to be underpinned by a strong programme for government and policy platform. And I believe that in any post-election negotiation, it has to be about policy, and it has to be about the type of programme for government that you can achieve. So if we do go into negotiations, and despite what these parties say before an election, if afterwards, because the numbers dictate it, they do talk to us and we're willing to talk to them, then it will be about policies, and we will only sign up to a programme for government that is Republican, progressive, and deals with the issues. Because one thing is for certain, we're not going to go into government and sit there and have reports coming out every week where homelessness continues to increase, where poverty continues to increase, where the numbers of people waiting for health treatment continues to increase. The only scenario that we would stay and want to be in government is having a programme for government where these things start to decrease and where we deal with them. And that's the basis, the only basis upon which we'll be in government. And whether we're a majority or minority, obviously I'd prefer to be a majority party in government, but if we're not, it will all depend on the type of programme for government that we can negotiate, and that's a challenge for the other parties.
So on to the presidential election, which has been the talk of the country for the past couple of weeks. The Waterford Council recently heard pitches from prospective presidential candidates like Gavin Duffy, Senator Joan Freeman, Patrick Feeney, Marie Goretti Moylan and Kevin Sharkey, who also hope to contest the election against Michael D Higgins. Is there anything that the candidates represent that Sinn Féin endorse?
Well, I think first of all, Michael D Higgins has been a good president. He's someone that I would personally like. He's someone that is very liberal. He's a Republican. Someone that is very good on social issues. I don't have a quarrel with Michael D Higgins at all. In fact, I think he has been a good president. But the reason why we decided to contest the presidential election is because in the first instance we believe we have something to offer ourselves. We believe there should be a contest. For example, I don't know, young people like yourselves, this would be the first time that you have a vote in a presidential election. If Sinn Féin had not made the move that we made, young people would not have a vote. It simply would have been Michael D elected unopposed. And I don't believe any candidate should be elected unopposed in any democratic election where the people have their say. So I think it was the right thing to do for us to contest the election. There would be similarities between the candidate that we put forward and the policy platform that we put forward and, for example, Michael D Higgins. I don't think we have much in common with Gavin Duffy. I think he's a right-wing business person who is doing this for personal reasons. Maybe it's an ego thing, I don't know. He can speak for himself. But I certainly don't see any real commonality between the type of policy platform he would put forward and
Sean Gallagher expressed desire to put his name forward. What do you think of that?
Again,
after what happened,
we have no fears of any other candidate. We have said in terms of all of those people coming before local councils that we won't be supporting any of them, so we won't be supporting any other candidate other than we have our own candidate, but we won't oppose them, so we'll abstain on all votes.
Okay.
So whether it's Sean Gallagher or Joan Freeman or Gavin Duffy or anybody else that decides to put their names forward, as many people as possible in the race is a good thing. So we have no difficulty with whoever wants to stand in the presidential election. But the other reason why, and the main reason why we wanted to have an election, is because it does give us an opportunity to have a debate about the type of Ireland that we want. And while the president obviously doesn't have power in relation to policy, the presidential election and the office of the president is a chance to talk about the bigger vision, the type of Ireland that you want. And you know, we've seen massive social change over the last 7 years, which a lot of it has been good, maybe some of it not so good. But we've also seen increases in poverty, increases in numbers of people in low wages. We're going to talk about housing later and all of those issues. And the president, whoever he or she is, can set the tone for these issues. Mental health, for example, is a big issue. So you can have a president that, you know, majors on these issues and in a very high level sense, I suppose, and from a visionary perspective, would be able to set out the type of Ireland that we want to see. So the type of campaign that we want to run, the type of presidential campaign will be, here's where Ireland is at, for good and for bad, and where do we want to be in 7 years' time? Where does Ireland want to be? Obviously a united Ireland is part of it, but it's broader than that. It's the type of Ireland that we want. And I think that's for the good, so I'm delighted that we've decided to contest. We'll have a candidate selected on the 16th of September, whoever that is, and then we will go toe to toe with all the candidates. Some we'll have things in common with, and some we won't, and that's the nature of politics.
Is it correct that perhaps Sinn Féin might encourage voters to vote number 1 for your own candidate and maybe number 2 President Higgins?
Well, the party hasn't taken any decision yet because we don't know who all the other candidates will be. I don't see a situation where we would advocate that people should vote in terms of their preferences for others. It's a different type of an election. Personally, and I suppose in a general election, we would always say that people should vote for parties of a similar mind, or as parties or individuals who are as close as possible to us. So it would be people who would be generally progressive on the left of centre or whatever, people who are genuinely Republican. We wouldn't obviously be advocating that people vote for right-wing candidates. So
would you include President Higgins in that category then, David?
I would see President Higgins as, personally, I would see him as somebody I would give a preference to. I've given preferences to the Labour Party locally. I've given high preferences to John Halligan, notwithstanding the fact that he went into government with Fine Gael.
We have questions on that later too.
I would have given him a high preference. I would have given preferences to the Greens in the past, people before profit. So I generally would vote for candidates that I would see as being progressive and on the left. And I would see Michael D Higgins in that space.
You've answered why Sinn Féin are contesting this presidential election, and you are the chairperson for selecting that person. Is that correct, your candidate?
No, not so much selecting the person, because that's a matter for the party.
Well, what's your role?
The role was the presidential election is quite unusual in that we don't have many of them, and while parties would have processes on how you select candidates for local elections, general elections, European elections, we didn't have a formal process for selecting a presidential candidate. In the last presidential election, we had a leadership initiative where Martin McGuinness decided he wanted to contest, and that would have been seen as who was going to go up against Martin McGuinness in terms of a
not going to happen
presidential election. So that was a different type of initiative. This time round, we have the numbers ourselves to contest. We have the requisite number of Dáil members to be able to nominate our own candidate. And what my committee was working on was working out what structures would need to be put in place to allow the party structures to nominate a candidate. So what we've done is we have allowed the regional structures, which are based on the European election boundaries. So Ireland South, Dublin, the North and Midlands North West, there are regional structures. And each of those regional structures will be able to nominate 2 candidates. And those candidates then will go to the Ard-Chorla, and the Ard-Chorla will decide. So if there's more than one, then obviously the Ard-Chorla has to decide. So it was to try and do it in the most democratic way possible. So the nominations are opening on the 20th of August and closing on the 10th of September, and the Ard is meeting on the 16th of September, and then we'll select our candidate. So that was the work of the committee that I chaired, and obviously when the nominations close, then we will forward those names to the Director of Elections that's been appointed, and then the Ard will make a decision.
And whose names are in the mix? We've heard Jerry Adams' name mentioned, we've heard Leonie Riada's name mentioned. Who's in the mix, David?
Well, I'm not going to name any. First of all, it won't be Jerry Adams anyway, that's for sure.
It won't be.
There's no chance of Jerry contesting.
Okay.
So it will be somebody from within the party. Leonie Riada's name has been mentioned.
It has.
I think she certainly would be someone that potentially will be one of those whose names will go forward. I know that the local branches in Waterford will be supportive of her as a candidate, so I think it's possible her name will be, but there is no nominations yet. There may be others in the party who are considering their names going forward, so I don't want to speculate on who may or may not get through a nomination process. The one thing that we need to do is to respect the party structures, allow the regional structures and the local structures to meet. A candidate has to have 6 common or 2 corlicanters. So the corlicanter are the county structures. So your local common will be your local branches. You'd have a Waterford corlicanter, which would be made up of city and county, the regional structure. So you need 2 of those type of structures to nominate, to have a successful nomination, or 6 local common branches.
So while you can't comment for other people, how about the name David Cullinane for president?
No. No.
No?
I think that there's a lot of people in Sinn Féin that could potentially make good presidential candidates, but there are equally people who see themselves as having a role to play in the Dáil.
Okay.
And as we transition into a party that wants to be in government, that's where I would see my place in the party. I wouldn't have any interest, I have to say, in a presidential election. And I don't believe I'd be a good presidential candidate in any event. I think you've mentioned Leah, there's a lot of others. I think they're in a place where they would see themselves as being in a place where they can offer something as a presidential candidate that I wouldn't, and maybe others wouldn't. But I just see myself as somebody who is happy in Leinster House, wants to continue playing a role there, and there's a lot of work I'm involved in the southeast, local issues and national issues that for me are best served in Leinster House, and the presidential election is obviously a different.
David,
That's fair enough.
Before we move on to the next topic there, you spoke very fondly of President Higgins, and I'm just wondering, do you think President Higgins represents Ireland globally on a positive scale?
Yes, I do. I think he has been. I have no problem whatsoever in saying that he has been a very good president.
Yeah.
I have no problem whatsoever in saying that he's someone that I personally like, someone that whose broad politics would be very similar to mine. Somebody that in the last election, I think I gave him a second preference. If I'm right, I think I did. So I've no problem with Michael D Higgins. And I think that the vast majority of people who vote for Sinn Féin would not have a difficulty with Michael D Higgins. But equally, and when that's said and people say, well, why would you put your own candidate forward? In a general election, as I said, I gave high preferences to other candidates who I would have something in common with, but I still contested myself.
Yeah.
Because that's what you do, you contest elections. Simply because there's somebody else in the field that might have similar policies doesn't mean that you don't contest an election.
Yeah.
So, I gave preferences to John Halligan. I gave preferences to Brian O'Shea in the past. I gave given preferences to Una Dunphy and to Green candidates and to others. But, they don't entirely align with everything I believe in, but a lot of their policies would. The same goes for Michael D Higgins. But the notion that because you have something in common with another candidate, you don't then contest yourself doesn't make any sense. So we're going, as I said, once all the candidates are declared, and we don't know how many there will be, there could be 4 or 5, there will be some I will have a lot in common with, and some I don't have in common with. But the one I would be supporting would be the Sinn Féin candidate, because that's the one candidate that I have most in common with.
Do you think that the role of president is merely a ceremonial role? Do you think there's much to it?
It depends on the president, and by and large it is, but it also, like a president, and a very good president, Mary McAleese I thought was a good president, and Mary Robinson was a good president, and we saw even when they left Mary Robinson, especially, they were seen globally as people who were very well respected. Mary Robinson worked for the United Nations, so it does make a difference if you have presidents of a very high calibre and people who represent the best of your country, and we would see the president as representing the entire island of Ireland. So somebody who represents the island of Ireland, then that can be powerful, and it depends on how you use it. And I think if you look back traditionally, when we had every president was either a Fianna Fáil or a Fine Gael president, the mould changed when we elected Mary Robinson, and then followed by Mary McAleese, and I think the actual role of the presidency changed, its stature changed, and they became vocal on issues. They led out on issues. They may not be able to set policy, but they were able to set the tone. And I think that's what a president should do. So I think we've seen changes in not in terms of the powers or the duties or the responsibilities of the president, but certainly we've seen changes in the people who occupy the offices and how they conduct themselves and how they can lead out on issues. And I think that's been hugely positive, and we want to see more of that.
Let's talk Brexit. You mentioned changes. Here's a big change, is Brexit. You're Sinn Féin spokesperson for Brexit, David. At the end of July, Deputy Leader Michelle O'Neill said it's increasingly likely that there will be no Brexit deal and a hard border will return. Do you agree with this assessment?
I think it was looking likely that the hard line of the Tory party were creating problems for the British Prime Minister. I personally believe that there will be a deal. I've always believed that. I don't believe it's in the interests of the people of Britain that they crash out of the European Union without a deal. But there's two different deals, and people get mixed up with the sequence of what's happening with Brexit. The first thing that has to happen is that a withdrawal agreement has to be put in place, and that legally has to be in place by March. And the withdrawal agreement deals with the nuts and bolts of Britain leaving the institutions of the European Union. And due to the December agreement of last year, that has to be that has to coincide with a protocol for Ireland that has to be attached to that withdrawal agreement, which deals with the backstop and with the whatever solutions are put in place for Ireland to avoid a hard border. So the withdrawal agreement has to be in place by March. If there is no withdrawal agreement, then Britain crashes out of the European Union with no implementation period, which is what's built into the withdrawal agreement. It will be 2 years where things will pretty much stay the same until there's a future trade agreement worked out. So that's my point. There's two elements to it. There's a withdrawal agreement that has to be in place by March, and then there's the future relationship issue and what type of trade and customs arrangements will be put in place between Britain and the European Union. That comes afterwards. But if Britain crashes out in March without any agreement, the World Trade Organization rules kick in. They crash out of all of the European Union institutions, and that will create chaos on an unprecedented level. And I can't see the British Parliament, I can't see the British public accepting that, and I don't think that any party that creates that will be forgiven. So we've seen in the past, very high level negotiations where all the doomsday scenarios are put out there. I would imagine there is a lot of work being done behind the scenes to prevent this from happening. And worst case scenario, I think what will happen is they will look for what's called an extension of Article 50 to buy more time. I can see a scenario where they will crash out as possible, but I don't see it. And it is definitely not in the best interest of Ireland, because if there is a crash out, we have an immediate hard border, and that would be disastrous. So I don't personally see it. I think there will be some arrangement. And I think the more interesting debate then will be, the more interesting negotiation once withdrawal agreement is in place will be what type of customs arrangement, what type of economic and trade arrangements will be put in place between Britain and the European Union.
To press you on that, because just from my own opinion, I find it a little bit interesting if there was to be no deal. Do you not think it could be positive on two different ways? Firstly, that it might increase the pace of United Ireland, because if there's so much chaos going on up in the north, perhaps that might increase the process of people up there wanting that border poll. And secondly, that if we give Britain a really good deal, this might encourage other countries to leave the EU.
Listen, there's no good Brexit, so there's no point in saying that we should plan for a doomsday scenario, a worst case scenario, on the basis that will force unionists into a United Ireland. I don't believe it will. And bear in mind that if there was to be a hard border, and if the north of Ireland was crashed out of the European Union against its will, and aligned with the rest of Britain, so you have England, Scotland and Wales in the north, crashed out of the European Union, and whatever consequences that would have, and the south of Ireland still in the European Union, what you're actually doing is creating more of an affinity with the north and the rest of Britain, and creating further divisions north and south, and a hardening of the border. And if anybody believes that that will be some sort of catalyst that will bring people together, I don't believe it will. I mean, we had a border for decades that didn't bring people together. In fact, it had the opposite effect. So I think that, look at what the backstop arrangement was meant to do. So the backstop arrangement that was agreed last December was to ensure that the entire island of Ireland would stay in the customs union and single market. In other words, that we have an all-island solution. That's a much better way to bring about a united Ireland, because it shows that the all-Ireland economy is the way forward, and not a partitioned economy, and one where the north is aligned with Britain. And it's going to be disastrous. I mean, you know, we certainly are not going to subject the people of the north to economic chaos in the hope that by starving them, that they will then, you know, agree to vote for a united Ireland. Like that's it's not the way
to do it.
And when we were talking earlier about the type of environment that you would want to have a debate on united Ireland, I think that would be highly fraught, a highly dangerous one. I think it's much better that we settle the Brexit issue, get the best possible result for Ireland, the best possible solution. I think we can get that, and then we can have a debate about united Ireland, and I think that would be much better for everybody.
Speaking about Brexit, David, could you tell us what this would look like and how the government should prepare for it?
Well, we shouldn't prepare for a Brexit in Ireland because we don't want one. So we're not planning for a Brexit in the way that it was promised by the Tory party and by the hard Brexiteers. It's not going to happen. They're not going to get the type of Brexit that Boris Johnson wants, or Michael Gove wants, or any of these guys want. It's going to be a different type of Brexit, if it happens at all. There will be some form of Brexit. I think Britain will leave the European Union, but there will be arrangements put in place where I think the customs partnership that's being talked about will be pretty much similar to what's there at the moment, where Britain will remain for all intents and purposes in a customs union and single market, but will be called something else. I think that there is obviously an attempt by the Tories especially, and this is like a hard right initiative here. This isn't something that's in the best interests of ordinary working people, because the type of Brexit they want is to allow Britain to have free trade agreements with the rest of Europe, but not be bound by the rules of the customs union and single market, be able to negotiate trade agreements with third countries, with other countries. But the only basis upon which they can do that is to have divergence on standards and rules. In other words, less environmental standards, less standards on workers' rights, and compromise on those issues, and a race to the bottom, if you like. And that's the basis on which they'll go and negotiate different trade deals. So they want the best of all worlds. They want to be able to have free trade with the rest of Europe, not align with the standards that we all agree, and then have less standards, and because of that negotiate with developing countries and other countries, and that would mean a reduction in environmental standards, a reduction in workers' rights, a reduction in the type of products, you know, that the safety and health and all of those things that have been progressive, and they want to unravel a lot of that for themselves to create an unlevel playing field to give them an advantage. And I don't believe that Europe is going to allow that to happen. Like, it's just not going to happen. So they're not going to be allowed to have the best of all worlds. But even if they did, what would that look like for ordinary working people? It wouldn't be. It would be manna from heaven for the hard right in the British Tory party. That's what they want. But it certainly wouldn't be good for the rest of Britain, which is the tragedy of Brexit, that a lot of working people were conned into voting for Brexit for all sorts of different reasons. But if we're to be brutally honest, immigration was a huge issue, was used very cynically during the campaign, very similar to what Donald Trump did, where he, you know, focused on immigration and made Mexicans and Latinos a scapegoat, and they were the problem when they're not the problem. And the same happened in Britain, where immigrants were the problem, immigration was the problem. Vote Brexit and we'll curb immigration.
Yeah.
And that's not going to work either, because you can't have an a la carte approach to the four freedoms, you know, and the free movement of people is one of them. So either you're in with that or you're not, and if you're out, you're out of everything. So I think it's going to be very interesting how they wiggle out of all of that, and that's why there are such sharp differences in the Tory party, because you have people in the Tory party who know that that type of Brexit is not going to happen, Europe is not going to agree to it, and in that scenario all they can do is crash out, but crashing out is a disaster. So nobody really knows what's going to happen. So while I'm more on the optimistic side that it will be a deal, it's always possible there won't be. I mean, politics is in a very strange place. I've watching over the last few days what's happening in the US and tweets coming from Donald Trump. I mean, he's rewritten the rule book on how you conduct yourself as a politician. It's funny at one level, but it's also tragic. You know, calling women, referencing a woman to a dog, sacking people and calling out people who are held very senior positions, former FBI directors, former CI directors, mad stuff that's happening. And
you couldn't write this shit.
And again, embracing the alt-right, having Nazis in the Oval Office. I mean, it's crazy stuff that's happening, and it's very dangerous. So politics is in a very strange place, and we're seeing that in Europe as well. Far-right parties are growing, which is why, and I just make one point on this, it's very important that the future of Europe is seen in that context. The reason why that's happening is because people have become disenchanted from what they see as an undemocratic, more bureaucratic European Union. And we've always held a position, we've campaigned against European treaties that created that undemocratic Europe. It's very important that when Europe is looking at changes and there's a debate in the future of Europe, that it's a bit more democracy, not less. And it's about building a social Europe. And I think if we move more in that direction, we could actually undermine the rise of the far right in these countries.
David, there's a lot of discontent in the primary industry in Ireland at the moment. Fishermen especially, they're very unhappy with the quotas, and they were recently banned from fishing in a prawn ground up the west of Ireland, while French and Spanish fishermen are allowed to fish. So do you think in light of this we should take their recommendations, and with Brexit coming, do you think we should reconsider our status within the EU as well?
Absolutely not. I think it would be disastrous for Ireland to even contemplate leaving the European Union. I mean, the best answer to that would be the Tory party and those who favoured Brexit recommended that people should vote for Brexit, but they had no plan. So if anybody is going to recommend that Ireland leaves the European Union, well, what's their plan? What's going to happen when we leave? What type of economic advantages are we going to gain? I don't see any. A small country, small island like Ireland, opting out of a customs union and single market, opting out of the arrangements that we have in all sorts of areas, I think would be disastrous. It would be certainly bad for farmers, that's for sure. Disastrous for farmers.
But do you think
fishing
it would be
is
beneficial to fishermen? Really?
Well, I think it would be more beneficial to fishermen if we got better rights, and we had a better position from Irish governments who are fighting for fishermen. I don't think you can just pick one section of an economy and say that, well, because that hasn't done as well as maybe we think it should have, we should come out of the European Union in its totality. I mean, I think that would be the wrong way to approach it. A better way to approach it would be, well, it's an issue, and I have attended many conferences on fishing. I know a lot of their issues. Some of it is down to conservation. So I mean, there's initiatives that had to be taken to preserve fishing stocks. A lot of it was there was a trade-off in Europe, obviously, on we did well from farming, but not so well on fishing.
That's right.
And I think there was bad deals done by former governments, especially Fianna Fáil governments, not just on fishing but also on oil rights, for example, and all sorts of deals that were done as part of trade-offs. But I definitely think fishermen have been hard done by. I think that there is an awful lot more that can be done. If we look at Waterford, for example, there's huge opportunities in Dunmore East. There is a lot more going on now. I think there's very ambitious plans that the harbour has to extend the harbour, to build another breakwall to make sure that it can be a place where fishermen work, where we have cruise ships coming in, where we have the lifeboats there as well, the RNLI base there, and just having a lot more activity, and that benefiting the local village, and so there is huge potential. But my point is, yes, have fishermen got a raw deal? Absolutely.
If Sinn Féin were to come into power, would you fight for fishermen?
We always have, and Martin Ferris would have been one of our spokespeople. Leonie Reid in the European Parliament is the only Irish MEP who sits on the Fisheries Committee. She actually held a conference in Waterford last year where we brought together all of the fishing organisations, and we had speakers from the different organisations who spoke about their needs. So our policies are very much aligned with where they are at. And a balance has to be struck between what's possible and then maybe the type of quotas that we can get, but also recognising that we have to preserve fishing stocks as well, and that so there's a balance to be struck, but there's definitely an awful lot.
Can we strike a happy medium?
Absolutely, yeah.
Let's move on to Gavin with the next current affairs question.
David, as I'm sure you're aware, this week marked the 20th anniversary of the Omagh bombing. And in the past, Sinn Féin have met with Hamas representatives and also members of the Castro regime. How would you respond to claims that the party is sympathetic towards terrorists or other dictators in the world?
Well, first of all, the Omagh bombing was absolutely wrong. It was a criminal act in my view. There was no justification whatsoever for it. Was carried out by people who were actually hostile to Sinn Féin. Many of those groups have targeted Sinn Féin representatives. In fact, in recent times, Jerry Adams' home was attacked by some of these groups. Some of our leaders in the north had their homes attacked as well. But they're a very, very small, unrepresentative group, and I think since the Omagh bombing, and in fact it was Martin McGuinness who led on this, so I think he described some of these groups as traitors, and some of those individuals who are still involved in these actions as traitors, and said so in the presence of the PSNI senior officer, I think it was the chief constable, which caused some controversy, but in my view it's the right thing to do. So I have no truck whatsoever with any of these so-called dissident groups or Republican groups. I think they should disband and support the peace process, and there's a peaceful path to United Ireland. They have no strategy, there's no logic to their position. As regards other leaders, I'd make no apologies whatsoever for Sinn Féin meeting with Fidel Castro in the past, and I certainly would make no apologies for Sinn Féin supporting the Palestinian struggle, as we did with the South African struggle. I mean, Nelson Mandela, for example, when he came to Ireland, always made the point that the one party, the one movement that best supported the anti-apartheid struggle was Sinn Féin. Many people now, years later, will try and take credit for it, will align themselves with Nelson Mandela, will align themselves with the anti-apartheid struggle, but they weren't part of it at all. So we have a long track record in supporting struggles around the world. The Palestinian struggle is an obvious one where I support a two-state solution, so I support obviously the right of the state of Israel to exist, but equally the right of the state of Palestine should exist. And what's happening in Palestine is incredible. I don't think there's any comparable scale to the living conditions of Palestinians. Gaza is just an open-air prison. The type of policies pursued by the Israeli government are despicable. There's still settlements being built, driving Palestinians off their land. I mean, it's horrific what's going on. And yes, there's attacks coming from Hamas and attacks coming from others, and I don't agree with the bombings of Hamas. I don't actually support Hamas as an organisation because they wouldn't have a lot in common with me, I would imagine, on social issues. But they are democratically elected by the people of Palestine. They are the Palestinian government, so you can't pick and choose. That's a matter for the Palestinian people to choose who their leaders are. But one thing is for certain, because our own experience teaches us this, and we saw it in Colombia in recent times, we saw it in Sri Lanka and other places in the Basque Country where Sinn Féin sent people over to be part of emerging peace processes there. Politicians in Britain who met Sinn Féin leaders when the IRA campaign was on were pilloried and were told that they were sympathisers of terrorism and all the rest of it. But who's been proved right? I mean, they sat down and talked to Sinn Féin. Eventually, British Prime Minister sat down and spoke to Sinn Féin. We eventually worked out a peace process, and that peace process is now one of the most successful peace processes. You will not have any peace process in Palestine unless it's underpinned by justice for both the Palestinians and the Israelis, and unless you have every side talking to each other. There's no other way around it. So that's what needs to happen. So like we will sit down, and we've spoken to Israeli politicians. Equally, we'll talk to Palestinian politicians, people who are democratically elected. And Cuba is obviously a different situation, but the Cuban people have been subjected to a blockade for decades, which has tried to control the people, tried to force them into changes that they weren't happy with. And in fact, you know, I was in Cuba myself on one occasion, and there is a lot of poverty, there's no doubt about it, but compare that poverty to surrounding islands in that part of the world, where there's huge differences between the poverty levels, extreme wealth and extreme poverty in these islands around Cuba. You don't have that in Cuba. So even despite the blockade, the huge sanctions imposed on the country, they were able to make the best of it. I don't agree with Fidel Castro on everything either. I don't support dictatorships. I don't support the undemocratic systems that they have. But nor do I support the type of interventions we saw from America. So again, us talking to people like Fidel Castro doesn't mean that you agree with everything they believe in. I mean, we sit down and talk to former RUC officers. We sit down and talk to former loyalists, people who tried to kill Republicans. You know, you see, talking to people doesn't mean that you agree with them.
Let's talk poverty. Pictures emerged last week of a family sleeping in a Garda station. Your approach is different to Fine Gael's regarding homelessness. In your Better Housing Plan, Sinn Féin says that they'll build 100,000 new social houses, and in your 2018 budget you say you'll build 9,000 social houses in a plan costing €702 million. It's an ambitious plan. Sinn Féin have also called for the abolition of the local property tax down through the years. So David, with all of this in mind, where's the money going to come from to pay for these houses?
Well, first of all of our alternative budgets are costed. So if anybody is genuinely interested in where the money is going to come from, they simply have to log on to our website, download any of our alternative budgets, and you'll see all of the costings, all of the revenue raising proposals that we have, and all of the spending cuts that we will put in place as well in areas where we believe that savings can be made, where there's unnecessary spending.
So for our listeners, how are you going to do it?
First of all, I'm saying that all of the proposals that we make, while we say we want to invest in housing and health, we then say where it's going to be paid for. Some of the headline issues are that we wanted a third rate of tax on incomes over 100,000. Some people then would argue, well, that's too much on those who earn over 100,000. If you earn €150,000 as an example under our proposals, your first 100,000 you pay exactly the same. It's only on the balance, so on the 50,000 you pay an extra 7 cents on every euro that you make, and that brings in about €500 million. We wanted to increase the betting tax, for example, bring in a sugar tax. We want to increase capital gains tax. We wanted to abolish some of the tax shelters and breaks that were given, for example, the vulture funds who are coming in building or buying up people's mortgages. We saw with some of these big multinational companies coming in, the type of tax arrangements that gave them very favourable tax rates, and in fact opened us up to accusations that we were we were operating as a tax shelter for a lot of these companies. So there's a whole range of measures that can be taken, but the point is this, and this is like, we can go through the detail, and there's so many of them. There's dozens of proposals that we make, and I'll give you some flavours of what they are, the big ticket ones, but there's lots more. The question you then have to ask yourself is it the right thing to do to have a more ambitious public housing programme? And in fact, I think our proposals are modest. I don't think that they're in any way extreme. I think the numbers that are needed, the numbers that we want to build are needed just about. We could actually probably should build more. But we have to cut our cloth according to our measure, and we have to then, as you say where the money is going to come from. And we can't solve all the problems in the economy in one term in government, and nor would we even claim that we could. So we'll take some time to deal with a lot of the crises that we have. But the bigger question is, either we're going to tolerate a situation where people are homeless in record numbers, where people are on hospital trolleys in record numbers, or we do something about it. And if you do something about it, you have to make the changes and you have to make the investment, or you don't. So the position of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael is to speak from both sides of their mouth to say, we empathise, it's terrible, but come budget time, like last year, they cut the top rate of tax. I benefited from it. I didn't need a tax cut, but and I don't see the fairness in doing that at a time when we have all of these pressures. So you can't have it both ways. You can't have parties saying we're going to sort the housing crisis and the health crisis and spend more on childcare and education, all these areas, but we're also going to cut taxes everywhere. You can't do both, and we've seen that. And bear in mind, there's a dishonesty coming from these parties as well, because during the last election campaign, the big promise from Fine Gael especially, and to a lesser extent Fianna Fáil, was we'll abolish the universal social charge. And we told them it couldn't be done, and they attacked us for it, and they haven't done it. It's still there. And the reason why they haven't done it is it can't be done without having to put in place more cuts in public spending, and that will obviously create deeper problems in public housing. So I think people need to be, and it's right that people would ask Sinn Féin, how are we going to pay for all these things? We have no difficulty, which is why we publish an alternative budget. Fianna Fáil, by the way, didn't publish any alternative budgets. We don't know how they are going to do any of the things. They say they want to do all the things that we say need to be done, but they'll also have all these tax cuts, and it can't be done. It's not possible. So we actually think it's a good thing that people are now beginning to drill down into what politicians are saying and scrutinise it. We believe our policies stack up and will stand up to scrutiny, and we'll stand over it. So people don't have to agree with us, which is that's the thing about democracy and politics. People can say, I don't agree with that. Yes, by raising this money, you might be able to deal with these problems over here, but I'm earning 150,000 a year and I want to keep as much money as possible.
So and they're entitled
to vote for parties who support that.
At its basics, simplifying it down and stripping it down to what it is. I know it's not always easy to do, but for listeners who just want it stripped down at its basis, voting for Sinn Féin would entail higher taxes, but good social system. Is that correct?
Well, higher taxes for those who can afford to pay more. We also would want to see those on lower incomes taken out of the tax net. So it's about the type of tax system that you want. Like, everybody accepts that some of the tax shelters and tax loopholes that we've created for very wealthy people is not a good thing in a society where you have people sleeping in Garda stations, or older people stuck on hospital trolleys. I mean, that speaks to the type of society that we have. And it goes back to what I said earlier. We want a strong economy. We want exactly the same type of economy that those on the right say they want, a strong performing economy. Everybody wants that, and our policies would support a strong economy. But once that wealth is created, you then have a choice to make. Do you have fair taxation in place that then uses that wealth to benefit all citizens, or do you not? And we see this divide in every country. There's a left-right divide in every country. In most countries, we don't have it to the same extent here, because Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael have dominated politics, and they're both centre-right or right-wing parties. But it isn't that we're a high-tax party. There's a difference between being high taxes and fair taxes. I don't believe it's unfair to have a third rate of tax of 48% on income above 100,000. In fact, in America back in the 70s, that was as high as 80%, 90% under Carter, I think it was, under former US presidents, in a so-called bastion of capitalism. So I don't... again, it goes back to balance. You have to get the balance right. But we certainly don't have the balance right now. And it goes back to my overall point. Either we take a decision to deal with the big social problems that we have, or we don't.
Yeah.
And if we're going to take a decision to deal with them, then they have to be paid for. And we're prepared to say, we will do it, and here's how we'll pay for it. And people can vote for it or not. I mean, if people don't vote for it, and I'm elected out of office and other people are, that's fine. That's democracy, that's up to people. But my job is to convince people that what we can do is better, not just for the economy, but actually be better for the economy if you didn't have the report out today where rents now have gone up by 16 and 17%. How is that good? In Dublin, for example, 20% increases where people are paying 1,500-1,600 a month of their salary on rent. I mean, that's crazy.
Yeah.
And for all the talk of tax cuts, I mean, you get a €5 tax cut and your rent goes up by 200 a month. I mean, that's madness. That's not the type of, you know, society you want, and it's not good for the economy either. So, but yeah, we'll have that debate when the election is on.
So we've been experiencing water shortages all through the summer due to the extreme weather we've been having. And as we're getting back to normal now, there's a lot of brown water around. In my own community of Dunmore-East, we've had brown water for a couple of days. And this is maybe due to the fact that there's lead piping all over the country. So do you think, in light of this, that it's time to reconsider water charges?
Well, so the water charges debate was a false debate, because the amount of money that will come in from water charges is a fraction of what's needed to invest in our water infrastructure. It was about 170 million, I think, would have came in under the last charging mechanism until it was abolished. And that's a drop in the ocean in terms of what's needed. So the reason why, and this is, I suppose, the reason why we oppose water charges, wasn't because we don't want to see an investment in water infrastructure. It's because we saw it with other public services, with waste collection and others, where you commercialise the provision of water. You first of all bring in a charge. That then in time makes it attractive for the private sector to come in and buy up your water infrastructure, and then the prices go up and up and up. And we saw it with waste collection, where people had their waste collected, as they do in most European countries. You pay either a domestic rate, or you pay taxes, and you get basic services for it. That's what happens in the north. And then it's done on a fair basis. What happened was we privatised it. We brought a charge in first, started off at a very low amount, I think £10, £20 at the time, went up, and now families pay on average about $500 a year on waste collection. And you have a really haphazard service where you have 4 or 5 trucks going into the same estate on different days, and it actually doesn't even make any sense from an economic perspective. The same was going to happen with water. So this was, again, it wasn't necessarily about the amount, because once they brought in a water charge, it was then commercialising something that is a commodity that people need to survive, and we believe that's wrong. And in fact, in our alternative budget, we would have invested more in water than the government would have invested. So I don't think that's the issue. The other problem is that, well, the government is saying that they need to invest in infrastructure. In fact, about 45% of water is lost through the system, and has been so most of it is just leaked out, and that's what needs to be repaired.
Do Sinn Féin have a plan for improving water services?
Well, again, anytime anybody asks me, do we have a plan, if you Google Sinn Féin water, our plans will come up, fully costed, fully worked out, practical, realistic, deliverable. So, you know, there's a personal responsibility on people as well to actually inform themselves and educate themselves in what the policies of different parties are. Very often what happens is people revert to the sound bites from either political opponents or the media. So political opponents will say Sinn Féin doesn't want to invest in our creaking water infrastructure. Then you go and look at their policies, and you go and look at ours, and you say actually they want to invest more, and they've shown how they're going to pay for it, and they actually have a plan to deal with the real problem, which is the leaks in the system. In the first place, we were looking for district metering that would actually detect these leaks that we have, where it's 45% of unaccounted water and this is water that's treated and very costly. I mean, almost half of all the water that's treated is gone, is lost, is crazy. So that's where the problem is. And if we dealt with that problem, we wouldn't have water shortages, or certainly not to the same extent that we have. And again, people can have a debate on these issues, on water charges, but again, it has to be a genuine one. We come from a perspective that once you commercialise something like water, then it's no longer seen as a public commodity, as something that has to be made available because it's publicly, because it's such a vital resource for people. And we do have charges on water for businesses, so it isn't, and big companies, so it isn't that there isn't any charge for the big polluters. You know, there's water charges, but should we include households? I would argue not, but obviously that's an issue that people can have their own views on.
Let's move on to the last couple of questions on local issues then. So Gavin, you go ahead.
David, given the controversy surrounding John Halligan in recent times, do you think Sinn Féin will plan on running two candidates in the next Waterford general election?
Well, I certainly wouldn't have any objection to a second candidate. I know sometimes when somebody is a lone candidate or a TD, they might get precious about their own seat and would be hostile to another candidate coming in. I certainly wouldn't be. So I joined Sinn Féin back in 1996. We had about 7 members across Waterford City and County. We had no elected representatives, and I was part of a small number of people who built the party up over a long number of years. In 2002 we contested our first general election. In 2004 we won 3 council seats. In 2011 we won 6 council seats, and then we won a Dáil seat. We'll stand, I think, probably 10 candidates in the next local elections. So in that 10-year period we've gone from having no council seats to 10 council candidates. Is a phenomenal growth, and all of that happened because we stood more candidates, because we're not afraid, but we're not about standing still. It's about building all the time. But that will depend on what the party sees. You obviously have to be careful as well, that you don't stand two and then you split the vote, and we've seen it in areas where you can make a mistake by being overly ambitious. But that's a matter that a decision the party will make in due course. At the moment I'm selected as a candidate. We haven't selected a second one, but it is something that is being considered, and I certainly wouldn't have a difficulty in doing it. As for John Halligan and whether or not John stands, whether that would make any difference to Sinn Féin, I don't believe it would. I'm a bit conflicted on John in many ways, because I would have grown up with him politically, to use that expression, because we would have served together on Waterford City Council, and he has in many ways very similar policies to Sinn Féin and to myself. He came from the Workers' Party. He's very good on lots of social issues. I don't think it was wrong that he would want to go into government. I think it's worthy that anybody who is a national politician would want to serve in government. But I did say to him when he went into government with Fine Gael, and I met him the day afterwards when he signed up to the programme for government. I met him for a cup of coffee at his request, and I said to him that the problem that you will find is you are going to spend the next couple of years defending Fine Gael's policies and not talking about your own. Because once you're a small party or a small group in a government like that, it's the policies of the bigger group that will dominate. So that's what happened. So he spent his time apologising for rising housing lists and healthcare problems, and at the same time a lot of the big promises that he made in relation to a standalone university for Waterford, which I never felt was possible. I think that the merger with Carlow is the only viable option that was on the table. I was one of the few politicians who was honest about that going into the last election. The second cat lab, all big promises that were made and then not delivered. People will make up their own minds on that, and I'll let people make up their own minds. I certainly won't be going into the next election campaign negatively attacking him or anybody else. I think it's always better. Yes, you have to point out the failures of the government, and my job, and I said this to John when we met for that coffee, if you're now in government, I treat you the same as I treat anybody else in government. If I'm in opposition, I hold you to account. That's my role. But I'll do it fairly and based on policy, not based on personality or because it's perceived to be any electoral advantage.
So, David, you've hinted in the past that you would throw John Halligan a preference of some form when you're voting as a citizen. Could you, in good conscience, vote for him after everything that this government has done?
That's a good question. That's something I'd have to give a lot of thought to. I don't know whether John wants to. John says that he doesn't want to stand again. He's hinted at that very publicly as well. If he does stand again, obviously that's a matter for him. I'm certainly not hostile to him, that's for sure. And I certainly don't believe that he is a bad politician simply because he has gone into government. I think he might have made bad choices. I think he maybe was naive in how he approached a number of issues, and I think became a bit erratic as well for a time period where it was very much attacking the people he was in government with and thought that was going to get issues over the line, when in fact it didn't, and has probably the opposite effect, and possibly damaged him more than it damaged the government. So I don't want to be seen to say anything else, because again, when it can be seen as me just saying things for political advantage. John is someone that I have admired as a politician even before I got involved in politics. He's someone that I think has integrity, someone that is very good and has been very good and had long-standing views when it wasn't popular on issues like abortion and marriage equality and lots of other social issues. So I would always give him credit for those issues. And whether or not his time in government was successful is something that electors will make their minds up on. And when the election is called, and if he does stand, obviously the electorate will pass judgment on John's performance in government in the same way that they've passed judgment on others. And I will leave it to them. There are obviously things that I disagree with him on since he's gotten into government. And there's, as I said, I have no difficulty in accepting that there was naivety. But I don't think they were issues of integrity. There's a big difference between the two.
Do you think if he were to run again, do you think it's inevitable more or less that he'll lose his seat?
I don't know if it's inevitable or not. I certainly get a sense from talking to people that there's a disappointment. And I think it's always very difficult when you come from a left progressive political point of view when you go into government with a very right-wing government. And at the end of the day, if you're coming from a perspective that you are demanding change, which John would have spent his whole life in the Workers' Party and before that and even afterwards as an independent, presenting himself as an alternative to Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, and someone who was very radical in his views. And when I mean very radical, I don't mean irresponsibly. I mean very radical in that the opposite of what Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael were putting forward. So to go from that to sometimes, and I see it watching him sit beside the Taoiseach during leaders' questions or sit beside him in the Dáil and being in a government, and then watching every month as the homeless figures come out and they've gone up, and the trolley figures come up and they've gone up. John has to account for that. And I said that to him at the time, that you will be judged on what this government does, and you'll be judged not just on what you think you've achieved, but on the overall performance of the government. And people will. I think
David,
people make that decision.
when you were speaking about John there, you mentioned some of the big promises he didn't deliver on, and you said one of them was a second catalog. Do you think there's any possibility of Waterford improving the current situation we're in now?
I think the mistake and the naivety that was made then was that I'm a great believer in healthcare being delivered on clinical and medical need and on the basis of equality. And I would make the point that the two-tier system that we have, where people who have private health insurance, and not ordinary people who are on the lower packages who actually don't get much advantage of being on private health insurance, it's those on the top packages that actually get the best benefit, and that they jump the queue. And also geography plays an impact, where depending on what part of the country you live in, you can have better access to certain services, and we see it with cardiac care here. But at the same time, healthcare can't be delivered on the basis of local politicians saying, I want this, and I don't care whether or not there's any clinical or medical underpinning to that argument. So I was always of the view, and again, I refused to promise before the last election that Sinn Féin was in government, notwithstanding what any clinical or medical experts would say, we would deliver a second unit, because that's the wrong way to do it. I believe that the national review, which is ongoing at the moment, is the best way to deal with this issue. There is a very respected chair. There is a review panel that's actually looking at all of the data, all of the evidence, best practice internationally and so on, and they will then determine where additional resources or not should be deployed to ensure there's a quality of access for all patients across the southeast. That's the correct way to do it. If I was a Minister for Health, I would want to be making decisions based on sound clinical and medical need. The problem is that before the last election, people made promises they couldn't deliver, and after the last election, John told us that the review that was being conducted by Professor Herity was a formality. He was only coming down to tick boxes, and that was a big mistake.
Not true.
And he was coming down to do a job which was to look at clinical and medical need. Now, I have difficulty with his methodology, and I'm actually confident that this national review will come at it differently. I think there is a need for increased services, and I think the deployment of a mobile lab has shown that the mobile lab was only doing diagnostic angiograms, which is the diagnostic testing, and about 40%, so it's blasted through those wait times, and about 40% of people then who are tested will need some sort of intervention, but it can't do the interventions. So what we're now looking for is a modular lab that will come in and do both. But my point is that the data which has come from the mobile lab actually does show that wait times have reduced. So the clinical, maybe medical arguments that we didn't have then are maybe clearer now, and I'm hopeful that it will be done on the basis of this national review. But the one lesson maybe that's in it, in terms of this issue, is it's very emotionally fraught, and it's very easy then on an issue where people see an injustice and see very basically, we want this service, we want this 24/7 service, and I would want to see it in place as well. It's very easy and attractive for politicians to make very simplistic promises, but there's a danger in it. And I think there's a lesson in that for anyone that's going into government, that you should never make promises you can't deliver them. And healthcare shouldn't be based on what some local politician wants. Healthcare has to be delivered on the basis of proper medical, clinical need, and on the basis of equality. That's how I would see it, not on because I want something, I want it irrespective of what all the experts are saying. I don't think that would be in the interests of the state generally.
Our final question is also on promises made and promises not kept, and a local issue, and James has that for you.
Yeah, David, Waterford Airport have recently applied for a planning permission to extend the runway to, I think, over 2.2 kilometres, and to extend the width of the runway to over 20 metres. Well, it's of course still subject to the planning process, but if these developments do go ahead, do you think that the airport will be financially viable in the future?
Well, I've said for a long time that the only long-term solution for Waterford Airport is an extension of the runway. The type of aircraft that can take off and land at the runway is very limited. It's the turboprop plane, so it limits the number of carriers that can come in and operate in Waterford. So if you have a longer runway, you have different types of aircraft that can take off.
737 would be the largest, I think, they'll be able to come in.
Yeah, I don't even know whether that will be possible under this particular extension, because I don't know the extent of it yet. I know there's planning permission, and I'm waiting to do a meeting with the CEO of the council to see exactly what this involves, because that will then tell us what type of aircraft will be able to take off and land. But if it does involve that type of aircraft, that will be a game changer for the types of airline companies that can then come in, not just domestic ones but European ones, and could actually open up Waterford not just to routes in Britain but European destinations as well, so it would be massive. But what's interesting about this solution is it isn't a government solution. And I've said this for some time. If you look at a lot of the big wins that we've had in Waterford in recent times, the North Quays, for example, that was an initiative driven by the City Council and City and County Council, and they had to go and demand of government the money to actually make this happen, and it wasn't easy. The same with the Greenway. Again, it was a local government initiative, and the government did not give the council the money it said it would in terms of the Greenway, and it's the same with the airport. My understanding is that the money that's coming to develop the runway, if it happens, is mainly private sector funding. It's a private sector actor who's come in with, I think, about 5-6 million of a commitment on the table. Each of the local authorities in the southeast are putting up, I think, €500,000 each, just 2.5 million, and then there may be a need for about 2.5 million from the state. But again, it's the local authority taking the lead and almost begging the government to give them the money to make up the balance. So I don't think that it would be in the best interest of national politicians or local politicians to be coming out saying that this was a big win for them, when in fact this was an initiative. And I will give credit to the local council and the local CEO of the council who drove this, and when the government sat back and did nothing and created a situation where we had no carrier for the best part of a year and a half, it was actually, again, local responses and local initiatives which brought us to where we are. But if it happens, I think it would be massive, and linked in with the North Keys development, I think would be a big game changer for Waterford.
With everything going on in the world, the Brexit, the Trump, all the local issues that we have going on, a lot of people can feel disillusioned with politics. And you're always welcome back to our programme to discuss further whenever we have a general election. So my final ask of you, David, is just to say to our listeners at home why they need to remain optimistic in these times of change.
Well, first of all, politics isn't for the people who are in politics. So listen, politics isn't about the politicians. Politics has to be about the people of any country. And if you look at and I mentioned them earlier, the big social changes that happened in recent times, the abortion referendum wouldn't have happened if people didn't demand it. If that wasn't a core demand of mainly young women who were demanding this, and have actually now went beyond the abortion issue to demanding changes in the type of patriarchal society that we have, moving more towards equality for women, which I fully support, and men have to play a big part in that as well, in my view. The gender pay gap, all of those issues are now big political issues, but they're coming from a demand on the ground. The same with any of these issues, whether it's like cardiac issue where people take to the streets and they demand improved services. That's how you keep politicians in check. But it's also, there's an active role for people. And I'm sure in the United States, where there's a lot of people who are disaffected with Donald Trump, I think the solution is this, that for those of us who are looking at Brexit, for example, and looked at how some of the hard right in the Tory party were able to use immigration as a tool to get that over the line. If you look at the worst parts of Donald Trump's rhetoric, which is really divisive and really horrible, he tapped into a base where people were looking for an alternative. And I think there's a lesson to be learned by progressives, and if you look at mistakes that were made by Hillary Clinton, who wasn't a great candidate for the Democratic Party anyway, in my view. She was just seen as part of the establishment. But there was a sense over a time period where people who were progressive were talking down and lecturing to people rather than listening to them. And when Donald Trump came in and listened and spoke to them, it had an impact. So I think that there needs to be less of that. For example, if people have genuine fears on immigration, we listen. I think they're wrong. I think immigration and multiculturalism is good. In any country where you have people coming in, they add to your economy, they don't take away from it. The same with any set of rights for transgender people or for people who are gay or lesbian or whatever. Marriage equality, the sky hasn't fallen in this state since marriage equality came in. Yet you would think from those who were against it that that's what was going to happen. So I think that we have to listen to people. And I think we're actually in a different place in Ireland. I think one of the advantages and one of the best things about our country at the moment, notwithstanding all of those crises in health and housing, is that we don't have any party yet, thankfully, that has gone down the road that the hard right and the Tories have and Trump has, which is using immigrants or minority groups generally as a scapegoat for people's problems. And I think we're a better country for it, so that will give me hope. And I have, we all get disappointed and get angry with the political system, but the only way to get even is to change it. So my advice would be, whether it's Sinn Féin or whatever party people feel is the best engine for them, or even as an independent, get politically active yourself. And if not politically active, get active in campaigns in your community, and that's the best way to be effective.
You're always welcome back on our show. David Cullinane, thank you for appearing on The New View.
Thank you.
Very much.
Appreciate it.
Thank
Thanks
you.
very much.
Appreciate it.
Thank
Thanks
you.
very much.
Appreciate it.
Thank
Thanks
you.
very much.